So this lecture is going to be covering the Civil War itself, which means we're going to be talking about the actual fighting of the war, some of the battles, conflicts, and other significant events that took place during this time. And it is going to be the deadliest conflict the United States has ever faced up to this date. It's going to kill more Americans than any other war the United States has been involved in combined. And it's going to be deadly for several reasons, which we'll cover in this lecture as well. But first, I want to start out here with a little bit about the North. This lecture is definitely more North-centric. I have a whole lecture on the Confederacy, so if you're wondering why I'm talking about the North so much in this lecture, it's because I kind of cover the South a little bit more next time. We're going to talk about the Confederacy on its own. But we're talking about the fighting in the North here, and we'll start with mobilizing the North. How do they get soldiers? What happens? And that really happens after the attack on Fort Sumter, the first shots of the Civil War fired on that federal arsenal. And after that attack, Lincoln proclaims that this is, an insurrection, this is a rebellion, and he calls for 75,000 volunteer enlistees to come and help subdue the Southern insurrection. So he keeps raising the amount of volunteers that he thinks are necessary to supplement the army, and his whole goal really is to keep the Union together. At this point, Lincoln has one thing and one thing only on his mind, and that is to bring the South back. His The major animating goal of him the entire time of the Civil War will be keeping the Union together. Issues about slavery will come later, and we will have lectures discussing when and how slavery becomes more of a goal, ending slavery becomes a goal of the North during the Civil War. But in the beginning, Lincoln is all about keeping the Union together. He is terrified of the country breaking apart and terrified of it weakening the country, not just because they're going to fight one another, but because other nations might take advantage of a nation split in half, and that they're not strong enough apart. The country has to stay together. So just something to keep in mind. And now that'll be the first quiz question here too. What was Lincoln's first major goal in the Civil War? And that is a major thing that also encourages a lot of soldiers to enlist, is they want to keep the Union together too. They are determined to see the country remain one. They think secession or rebellion is treasonous, it's wrong, and they are hoping that they can end this conflict and restore unity amongst all of the states. So it's not only Lincoln's goal, it's also something that motivates a lot of men to enlist. But that's not the only thing that's going to motivate Northerners to fight in the Civil War. Another motivating factor for plenty of Northerners will be that plenty of them, right from the get-go, want it to be a war to end slavery. Remember, a lot of those abolitionists, people who want to abolish slavery, are Northerners. They're in the North. And a lot of abolitionists see this as the perfect opportunity to abolish slavery. That we need to make this war a one about getting rid of the system in the United States, and this is our chance. So they're seeing this as a crusade, really, to end this system and join the war in an effort to do so, to strike a blow against the southern states and bring about an end to the slave system. But others are motivated to fight in the Civil War, other Northerners, for more personal reasons too. A lot of them are just concerned that the South is being super aggressive. It has been aggressive. This insurrection was aggressive. And in the beginning of the Civil War, we know now in the future that the South never fully invades the North. The South doesn't occupy New York City or anything like that. But there were plenty of fears among Northerners that that might happen when the war first breaks out. That what if the South really gets its act together and invades and tries to occupy or take over the North? I mean, they're afraid that this might happen, so they're motivated to fight because they're thinking, I have to protect my family, my home, just from the potential of invasion. Another thing that motivates Northerners as well is more broad philosophical political ideas as well. They're going to be pretty heavily motivated by this idea to keep alive the dream of the founding fathers, the people who wanted all those first 13 states to get together and stay together as one country, that were willing to compromise and sacrifice to make sure that all of those former British colonies turned states stuck together throughout, no matter what might challenges they might face. And that's a very noble thought. It's also, too, to kind of show that a republic works. A lot of countries in Europe, ancient, old countries, are sitting back and watching this Republican experiment of a democratic style government unfold and just waiting for it to crash and burn and fail. And the Civil War seems to be that coming true. That, of course, this country would never last. A country founded on Republican principles. Of course, it was doomed to fail after not that long. And this seems to just be every hope and dream of those who wished ill of this experimental country to come true. So plenty of Northerners are thinking we can't let this happen. We have to show that this system of government works. It's been less than 100 years since 1775. They don't want to have a country have that short of a lifespan. So they'd like to keep it together and show that a republic can handle these type of problems. All right, the next question is the one that I put right on the screen there. Besides keeping the Union together, so not just that one, what were some of the other factors that motivated Northerners to fight in the Civil War? So they are motivated, lots of motivations, but they're also facing a lot of challenges, the North. Probably the biggest one is that the North and the South are huge. The United States is massive, massive, massive country. It's even more massive now than it was then because more states will eventually come in much later than this, and then we'll throw in Alaska and Hawaii for good measure. But even Civil War era, the United States is huge. The North is huge. The South is huge. And that's going to make invasion difficult. Classic warfare is you try to invade, conquer, and occupy a city. You really, how in the world is the North going to occupy all of the South? Look at all these states that have seceded. Look at them all. There's a lot down there. Wow. You're not occupying that entire thing. You can't. It's too big. So the North is faced with just strategic challenges of what to do to fight this war. Their strategy is eventually they're just going to adopt a strategy of meet the enemy where they are and fight them here, there, and everywhere. They're going to also try to occupy the capital city of the Confederacy because these states secede, they leave the Union. They're not calling themselves the United States, they're the Confederate States of America. And they have their own state capital. It's going to be Richmond in Virginia. So the North is also going to try to occupy Richmond as a strategy as well. They're going to think, okay, you need to capture a capital city. That's kind of the end of the game. But it's going to prove very difficult because Virginia is going to be very well guarded and very well fortified. So that's not going to come till the very, very end of the war. Another challenge the North faced was that their army was almost entirely consisting of untrained volunteers or just very poorly trained volunteers, or even just soldiers who'd been career army who weren't really used to this type of fighting. There wasn't really anything before the Civil War that they're really worried about. I mean, yeah, a couple conflicts here and there, but nothing to this scale, and just not enough people that are experienced on the battlefield. So you've got a bunch of just people who are passionate about a cause of keeping the country together, fighting this incredibly deadly conflict on both sides, really. It's certainly not going to help the North. So it's, despite their motivations, they are faced with a lot of challenges like this. And that is the next question, of course. What were some of the challenges that the North faced in the Civil War here? And it's going to, of course, I mentioned this before, and I will mention it again, that this is going to be a very deadly conflict. It's not going to be helped, the deadliness, by the fact that it's a huge geographic area. You don't have very well-trained people fighting it, but it's also going to be made very deadly by the fact that a lot of the new technology is going to be super modern and good at killing and good at kind of dragging this war out, really. The Civil War has kind of the dubious honor amongst military historians of being considered the first modern war. The first war fought with new technologies, with mass-produced technologies, with huge, huge amounts of people, and with a lot of new methods of communication. So for the United States anyway, this is really the first modern war. Some people argue that the Great War, World War One, is, but it's not. The Civil War gets that distinction, especially amongst American historians looking to kind of claim that distinct honor there. But there are a lot of factors that make this war, a modern conflict, and probably one of the most obvious ways that it's a modern war is that it has more modern weaponry. The gun here, pictured here, is an Enfield rifle, Enfield, if you want to look those up and see more of them, an Enfield rifle. And these are going to be produced in factories. They are going to be a lot more deadly and a lot more accurate than the ye old muskets. So these are going to make the war definitely something that has a lot more of a serious air to it, where people are firing more shots per minute. They have a lot more accuracy, these rifles, about 600-yard accuracy, and and they're mass produced, so they're more widely available for just the regular foot soldier. Every infantryman is going to be carrying one of these, especially in the north, because factory produced goods are cheaper, they're standardized, so you have these easily readily available deadly weapons in the hands of almost every northern soldier and southern soldier too. They're going to have plenty of rifles as well. A lot of huge, massive new artillery pieces. The Confederates are even going to build a submarine. Look that one up. It's called the Hunley, Hunley. It's very interesting. They build a submarine, they sink it, everyone dies, but they're trying. They are doing a lot more of this technological advancement. All that stuff we learned about the Industrial Revolution, the Market Revolution, they're applying those technological advances to fighting a war, making it a deadlier conflict. The Civil War uses some wacky stuff. They even have observation balloons, which are basically hot air balloons that you float above around a battlefield to try to look around and gauge the movements of your enemies. Doing all sorts of stuff, new experimental technology really being used for the first time in the Civil War. But it's not all weaponry. It's also, if you over here, you see this little etching of the commander sitting down in his chair, the little officer. What's he tapping away there at the table? That's a telegraph. And yes, that is a telegraph wire. They have set up a telegraph station in a tent. And stuff like telegraph communications would allow more communication, indeed, between leaders and soldiers, between different units to convey troop movements, weather reports, intelligence reports, battle plans. So it's the first war really using this new technology to help fight, to help as a tactic, as a strategy. Same thing with railroads. Railroads are going to be a new modern convenience that will be applied, that will be used in fighting of the Civil War. Both sides will use rail lines to move troops around, to move supplies to as close to the battlefield as they can, where previously it was just horses, horse and wagons, or just people, unfortunate foot soldiers carrying stuff around. So all of this modern technology that we discussed that was opening the West is going to be applied to the battlefield in the Civil War. All right, next question. Why was the Civil War considered a modern war? I also mentioned a little bit about how this modern technology made the Civil War very deadly. And I want to talk a little bit here about something that the Civil War is pretty famous for, and that's the death count that it has and the injuries that these modern weapons inflict. One of the modern advancements was something known as a mini ball. On the spelling is on screen here. And the mini ball is a type of projectile that is slightly different than older projectiles. So it's kind of like a bullet, without a charge inside of it. It's a pointy little thing, and you put it in a gun. But what makes mini balls so deadly is the fact that they tend to cut a path through when it hits the human body. A mini ball tends to kind of cut a straight path and go all the way through. So instead of lodging in somebody like a little musket ball might not kind of penetrate somebody's body, a mini ball would. It would go in and out. So they leave an entry wound and an exit wound. And that's a lot more openings in the human body to introduce disease. It's a lot more of an opportunity to bleed out. So they are very, very deadly. And the thing with mini balls was instead of when they would hit a bone, like pictured here, they would just shatter it. So a lot of time, and sometimes they would also just flatten if they hit bone. So there was two different horrible ways a mini ball could go in you. It could either hit your bone and shatter it like this picture here, or it would flatten against the bone and then it would move around and leave this very jagged path inside of your body. So no matter what happened, if you were hit by a mini ball, it was not a good day. A lot of times, your only option was to amputate the limb that the mini ball had hit because this is the 1860s. They're not doing reconstructive surgery on a shattered bone. They're just taking the whole limb off. They don't have the technology yet to do that. And about 60 to 70,000 amputations were performed during the Civil War. And this is where a lot of people would die. You didn't have a very fantastic chance after you had a limb amputated because they're not sanitizing anything. There's no antibiotics, there's no cleaning saws between limbs cut off. You more often than not got an infection, and if your body wasn't able to fight that off, you died, and that was it. The Civil War is really infamous as well for just being a very brutal conflict. A lot of the deaths are attributed to disease from battlefield wounds, like getting shot with a mini ball, or just getting some type of awful camp disease like dysentery, which is, if you must know, it's death by rampant diarrhea. You just lose all of your liquids that way and you die. Around 200 to 400,000 people would die from disease during the Civil War, and that's a huge chunk of the death toll. The estimated death toll has been increasing over the years. Historians first thought it was somewhere in the range of about 500,000 to 600,000 deaths, but more accurate counts, more accurate looks at census records have put that number somewhere around 750,000 people being killed during the Civil War. If you think about that number and you think about anywhere between 2 and 400,000 people dying from disease, that's a big chunk of the death toll coming from disease. And again, part of it is the weaponry they're using, very accurate rifles, mini balls that do a lot of damage to the human body when they make contact, and just lack of germ theory. There's no concept of infection and disease coming from invisible microbes from something that you can't see. So they're not sanitizing anything. You use a saw, like just a regular kind of a saw, looks very similar to what you cut the tree down with. You saw somebody's limb off to amputate it, and guess what? You don't even throw water on it between cuts. You just keep on going down the line and amputating limbs, and you pile the limbs up, and the limbless people, those who've had amputations, are really at the mercy of fortune if they get an infection or not, if it sets in or not. It's not that barbaric. I'll throw that in there. They do try to chloroform people, the little chloroform dip in the cloth, and you put it over someone's mouth and they pass out a little bit to try to numb them up a bit before just going right for it and amputating the limbs. But it still does nothing to help with the potential for infection. And a lot of those diseases are again a mix of just nasty, quick spreading epidemic style diseases that spread through camps and those who succumb to infection. All right. Next question. What caused so much disease and injury during the Civil War? All right, now for some battles. I've talked a lot about fighting and dying, so it's time to actually talk about a few battles here. I'm going to talk about a couple different battles, both of which happened at Bull Run in Virginia. You'll sometimes hear this called Manassas. As an aside, both sides of the Civil War, North and South, called all their battles different things. Isn't that helpful for remembering about your Civil War battles? The North had a habit of naming their battles after towns, and um, it was no, that it was I mix that one up. I always do that. The North likes to name their battles after rivers. The South likes to name it after towns, but they all give it different names. So the this one is called Bull Run after a nearby creek, but it's also called Manassas, which was a nearby town. So again, yeah, see, everyone gets confused about these. But Bull Run, regardless of what we're calling it, and for this purposes of this lecture, I'll be calling it Bull Run. The Battle of Bull Run is extremely significant because it happens very early on in the conflict, July 1861, and it is really the first significant engagement between Union and Confederate forces happens in Virginia. This is the first real meeting of the armies. And this is where they first kind of have to test each other and see what's going on. And it goes very, very badly for the North. It is a huge defeat. The Union or the North lose. They're calling themselves two things now. They're either the North or the Union because they are fighting for Union. And the Union has to just is absolutely surprised by how virulent and violent the South is at this conflict. A lot of Americans thought that this would end the Civil War, that they would just kind of duke it out on the battlefield. Everybody would get tired and go home, and somehow they would just figure out a way to solve their problems. But the first Battle of Bull Run especially shows the North, that the South is dead serious about this. They're fighting and killing, and they're willing to die for this. They're taking this absolutely seriously. This is going to be a lot harder and longer than they thought, and this is also going to be a lot deadlier than they thought. There are stories about picnickers, like people coming down to picnic and watch this battle, thinking that it would be something amusing to see, and just running away in horror after witnessing the gore and the violence that they see. They're running away frantically. The troops are running away frantically, the northern troops, because they were not prepared for this. Their idea of battle and fighting is something really abstract and heroic that they'd never been exposed to what they're witnessing on the battlefield in Bull Run. They're witnessing cannons blast human bodies apart. They're seeing mini balls bust people's bones up. They're hearing young men screaming for their mothers in agony on the ground. This is not a picture of war that anybody had envisioned. So the first Battle of Bull Run is an absolute disaster for the North. They're untrained volunteers. They were not prepared for it. They have this chaotic retreat that's super embarrassing. And it shows them again that this will be a much longer conflict than first anticipated. It also leads to Abraham Lincoln initiating a change in leadership of the Union Army. The first leader was there was a couple different leaders in place, and Lincoln replaces Winfield Scott, the first leader, with this guy here, Major General McClellan, George McClellan. And McClellan ends up becoming kind of the big hero of the North when he replaces Winfield Scott. As just in case you're wondering why it says the Great Potomac Army up there, that was another name of the Northern Army, to throw another name in there. They were the Union, the North. They were also the Grand Army of the Potomac. That was kind of the major wing of the fighting force of the North. So McClellan takes over um, after the kind of disaster of Bull Run, and he gets that job because he'd gotten some fame in an earlier skirmish there. But Bull Run really makes the North have to reconfigure a lot of stuff, just their expectations and also their leadership. The reason there are two battles of Bull Run is because they go head to head at Bull Run once again in August 1862. McClellan ends up leading troops again at Bull Run, and sorry, they do lose again at the Second Battle of Bull Run, mostly because McClellan is up against Robert E. Lee of the South, and Robert E. Lee is a very able military commander. He is very well trained, he's very motivated, and he is going to cause a lot of grief for the North. So when Robert E. Lee wins the Second Battle of Bull Run, the second engagement between the North and the South, he's really going to want to keep that momentum going. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Let me throw in your question here. Why were the battles of Bull Run so significant? So Lee wants to keep his momentum going after winning that second engagement at Bull Run, so he initiates the Battle of Antietam on September 17th, 1862. And this is going to be a clash at Antietam Creek in Sharpsburg, Maryland. So, yes, if you've heard of the Battle of Sharpsburg, this is the same thing because they're giving them those weird names, creeks versus towns. Strange naming conventions. Anyway, so the Battle of Antietam is an invasion attempt. They're pushing further north by the South, initiated by their commander, General Robert E. Lee. And he really is hoping that by initiating this offensive, he will be able to potentially capture Washington, D.C. Lee would love to end this war quickly. He doesn't want to see any more Southern soldiers die. He wants to force the North to the negotiating table and hopefully have them acknowledge the South's independence and wrap this up. But Lee has another kind of secret motivation for initiating this battle, the Battle of Antietam. And that is, he is really hoping that a flashy victory will gain him some international recognition. Lee and the rest of the southern states are super desperate to have another country recognize their independence. They would love to see France or England support them and acknowledge the South as a sovereign, autonomous nation. Just like when the revolution happened and France recognized the United States as a country separate from Britain, that really helped the war effort. So Lee is hoping that if this happens here, it will lead to France or England giving them money and maybe even military support like soldiers or just even a recognition of their independence. Fun fact, nobody ever recognizes the South as an independent nation. They never get a single country that ever acknowledges them in any capacity as a legitimate country or entity. So Lee has his goals for Antietam, and it ends up being an extremely, extremely bloody day, one of the bloodiest in American history, if not the bloodiest, I think it is. There are around 4,000 Americans killed in one day. This is a picture. During this time, photography is kind of in its late infancy, we'll say, and it's getting more widespread. So people are witnessing this at home, the carnage and destruction of the Civil War. They're seeing thousands of bodies buried in these shallow ditches because there's nothing else to do with them. It's another thing spreading disease is just there's piles of corpses everywhere after these extremely deadly battles. And about 18,000 people are wounded in that one day, too. 2,000 of them will later die from their wounds, so that adds to the death toll of Antietam. However, Lee is kind of foiled at this battle. He does not have this massive victory that he was hoping for to gain recognition from other countries, and he's actually forced to retreat due to some decent tactical planning on the side of the North and their just barrage of men that they send at him. And even though both sides suffer pretty heavy casualties, the Union, the North, does declare victory at the Battle of Antietam. All right. Next question. What is the significance of the Battle of Antietam? And it's not just these very easterly towns, so along the coast and sort of very much East Coast areas that are seeing violence during the Civil War. I point this out because I talk about the West in the beginning of the semester and then it kind of goes away. So I want to bring the West in again. But there is plenty of violence and conflict going on in the West, sometimes even just between Native Americans and the American Army as well. And the war in the West had been fought. There were some engagements in places like Tennessee between the North and the South. But what leads to a lot of violence in the West is the fact that there is so much demand for manpower that the United States Army withdraws a lot of its troops from the Western territories in order to fight on the East Coast. And they're hoping that they can supplement the fighting. They can bring the soldiers over and have them do the fighting in areas like Antietam and Bull Run, Virginia, a lot of it in Virginia. So they yank out a lot of the troops that were out there. And the problem with that is that a lot of the troop presence, the United States military presence out in the West in places like Colorado, were out there because they were supposed to be keeping the peace between the indigenous population and the settlers moving out. They were even supposed to be protecting some of the indigenous groups from white settlers, like not just keeping the peace between them, but making sure that there were no big issues going on between the expanding white settlers and these groups. And when the troops go away, the official, the official United States military that are aligned with the army and stuff, once they're pulled out to go fight in the East, the local militias really don't have much oversight anymore, and they are going to take advantage of that. And this lack of oversight from official members of the American military lead to the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado. This was in November of 1864, and the Colorado militia ended up attacking about 700 Cheyenne and Arapaho because they were rumored to have been raiding nearby white settlements. The Colorado militia descends upon these native settlements. They don't find anything hostile, but they attack anyway. They end up killing about 150 people, and eventually Congress was forced to declare this a massacre in Sand Creek. But it just shows that there are some unintended consequences of having to kind of take away the oversight of the United States military. And just to show that there is other violence and other conflict occurring due to the Civil War, not necessarily always exactly related to it. All right, next question. Why was there conflict in the West during the American Civil War? We're gonna go back to our famous Eastern states here and tackle the Battle of Gettysburg because this is extremely important, not just because it's the largest battle ever fought on American soil, but there are a lot of other things that happened because of Gettysburg. So talking about Gettysburg, Gettysburg is going to be another attempt by Robert E. Lee to invade the North and have a big, decisive battle that would hopefully destroy the North's morale, so the Union just feels absolutely defeated on its own soil. And again, hopefully show that he hopefully show other countries that the South is capable of fighting and winning and that they deserve that recognition as an independent country. So Lee has this. He's going to try again. Second attempt, really, to invade the North, destroy the North's morale, and get other countries to acknowledge the South as an independent entity. So he goes up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the northernmost battle of the war. And when he gets there, Lee is a little surprised to find that the Union, the North, are very well entrenched there at Gettysburg. And for 2 days, he would keep sending forces to try to dislodge them, but the Union was in a very good defensive position, and the South was never able to rout them out of it. One of the most famous instances of this is Pickett's Charge. Have you ever heard of General Pickett? He Lee ordered General Pickett to launch this just full frontal assault, a just total barrage of men to go and try to dislodge the Union. Most of them are just shot down as they run across this field trying to charge against these well-entrenched Northern troops. They never make it to the front lines, and the South is forced to retreat at Gettysburg and never make it that far north ever again. This battle that takes place in July of 1863 is indeed the largest battle ever fought on American soil. They lose tens of thousands of people. I'm pretty sure the numbers kind of vary based on whose estimate you're looking at, but the South ends up losing 28,000 people during the Battle of Gettysburg. The Union, the North, they lose 23,000 men. That is a lot of young men dead in the course of only a few days. This is another genuine photograph taken of just the aftermath of Gettysburg, just bodies strewn absolutely everywhere. The dead just sit where they fall. They're buried in shallow graves. They start to bloat and smell. It's awful and horrifying and just absolutely devastating for both sides. And Abraham Lincoln recognizes this. Abraham Lincoln sees that this is, yeah, they kind of won the North in a way that they didn't lose as many as the South, and the South had to retreat, but this is not good. This is just absolutely horrifying and just terrible. And Lincoln knows that the North is getting really tired of seeing pictures like this, of seeing their sons and brothers and husbands just slaughtered on the battlefield. And he's worried that this is going to make them give up, that the North will stop fighting and stop sending their young men into these situations, and that people won't want to fight anymore after this because they're so devastated by the scale of the loss that they're experiencing. Loss like they've never felt before, pictures like they've never seen before. And this is when he gives the Gettysburg Address that has the argument of you can't stop now, because if you do stop now, if you stop fighting the South now, every single one of these young men who died will have died for nothing because they were fighting to keep the Union together, and some of them were fighting to end slavery, and neither one of those things have been accomplished. So you have to keep going. No matter how hard it is, you need to show that a government of this style can work, and you need to see it through. These people were willing to die for it, so you should keep going for their sake. All right, next question. What was the significance of the Battle of Gettysburg? And it's not easy though. So Lincoln, he's trying. He's trying to motivate people and say, look, these people gave their lives for this cause. We need to keep going and not let their deaths be for nothing. But it's not easy because the North is just seeing a long, protracted struggle, years, tens of thousands of deaths, hundreds of thousands of deaths, and they're going to want to end it. There's going to be talk of capitulating or even just negotiating with the South. There's lots of discussions going on to just end the conflict and the fighting right now. It's not helped by the fact that another commander that takes control of the bulk of the Union Army, Ulysses S. Grant, is going to have a very awful strategy for winning the Civil War, and that is a war of attrition. War of attrition is when you realize that you are stronger and have more manpower than your enemy and use that to your advantage by just figuring that you have to just simply kill more of your enemy than they kill of you. It's something where you realize like you don't have to plan as well because you're thinking you could just use your manpower against the enemy. And Grant gets the nickname of a butcher of men because he's seen as just sacrificing needless amounts of lives in an attempt to simply kill more of the South than they can kill of the North. He's willing to send in waves and waves of men to fight in these battles, realizing that they can afford to sacrifice more people because they have a higher population, they have a bigger army. And you accept that high number of casualties thinking you can replace them, and the South can't. They don't have as many people waiting in the wings. Their armies just aren't as big. So it becomes a war of just let the South fight itself literally to death. Let them just keep coming at us, and they can kill plenty of us because we've always got more to spare. So it's a very cavalier attitude towards human life, but it can be very effective in combat, where if you know you have three times as many people, you can afford to lose two for every one that your enemy loses. So Grant becomes, even though he'll later become president, and sort of be able to ride his way into the White House on his laurels from the Civil War. He's not very popular in 1864 post Gettysburg, um, because the conflict has become a war of attrition, and he's just seen as a butcher. And by this time, spring of 1864, the North's morale and support for the war is at the lowest point ever. They're willing to compromise. And in the presidential election of 1864, this is when Lincoln is up for re-election. He's in real danger of losing to his opponent. You know who his opponent is? It's George McClellan, who had been his general there of the Army of the Potomac. And George McClellan is very disenchanted with the war, and McClellan is running on the platform of negotiating with the South, an immediate ceasefire, peace negotiations, and not continuing the fighting. Abraham Lincoln realizes that he is in a very bad situation. He's unpopular, the war is unpopular, people are thinking of just giving up. But then something happens that changes all of this. General William Tecumseh Sherman gets the nickname Old Tecumseh, pictured here, has a spectacular victory on September 1st, 1864 in Atlanta, Georgia. Old Tecumseh and his forces capture this very deep South city, and they occupy it very well, securely. It's the resounding victory that Lincoln needs to be able to show other Americans, okay, we're not losing everything. We just had a massive victory scored in the deep heart of the South. It's time to keep that momentum going and keep fighting the war. So Lincoln is able to use General Sherman's capture of Atlanta as not just a motivator, but also a platform for his reelection. And it works. This message to Americans that this resounding victory was going to be the beginning of a new string of victories, it works, and Americans are willing to keep going because they see this as a great motivating factor. It's not all over. There's still a chance. We just captured an important city. Don't give up now. Just like at Gettysburg, don't let this be in vain either. Old Tecumseh has Atlanta, let him keep it. And oh boy, does he. And we'll talk about what he ends up doing around in Georgia later. But it's so important because, in the minds of many historians, if Sherman hadn't captured Atlanta and had this great victory to show, General McClellan might have become president, and then negotiated with the South, and there might be a Confederate States of America below the Mason-Dixon borderline down there underneath by those southern states. So whether or not that would have happened is kind of conjecture and speculation. But even Americans then saw this as something that helped Lincoln secure his victory in the presidential election of 1864. Okay, final question. Why was the capture of Atlanta so important? And next time we get together for this lecture, next lecture you listen to is going to be a more of a focus on the fighting of the Confederacy, some of their motivations, some of what was going on in the southern states, and some other battles and things that were happening down there. So this lecture was very northern centric, and the next lecture will be more southern centric.